We are live.
All right, hello there. Welcome to Connected Learning TV, and this is the second webinar in a May 2015 series titled Equity by Design, DML 2015 Showcase. This is the theme for the DML conference. And if you're watching right now, we want you to take a moment and share this event with your networks, and we hope you know how to do that. I'm Alan Levine. I'm coming to you live from my home office in Strawberry, Arizona. I'm an itinerant, self-employed web geek, and also, I will say right here, I'm a white male ed technologist, and we'll deal with that in a second. But on this series on connected learning, we're going to be shining spotlight on topics and speakers from the 2015 Digital and Media Learning Conference. You should go. The conference theme is Equity by Design. It's going to be June 11th to 13th in downtown Los Angeles. And you can find everything about it at dml2015.dmlhub.net. And now for the main event, I'm talking with Audrey Waters, and I'm going to let her give her one-line bio because I think it defies it. But we're going to be discussing a lot how open learning and maybe EdTech maybe address educational inequalities. There's more than we can even get to in an hour. But I can't think of anybody better to talk to this than Audrey Waters. So before I let Audrey talk, like I can stop that, a couple details. If you're watching live right now, we want your comments and questions. You can send it by Twitter. The hashtags are, you know what a hashtag symbol is, DML 2015 and hashtag connected learning. You can use the Q&A feature in the Google Hangout. We're going to be trying to juggle. We hope we get a lot of comments. In fact, that could probably drive the whole discussion. But Audrey, you're like a chronicle of education innovator. You're like big time now.
Yeah, the big time, right. And thanks for the wonderful photo that accompanied my profile, right. Yeah, like you, I am an itinerant education technologist. I'm talking today from my home in Hermosa Beach, where it's actually raining. The folks in LA, I think, are probably happy to see rain today. People ask me why I hate education technology. I don't at all. But I think it's important that we are a lot more critical about education technology than I think the marketing machine wants us to be. I think that there are important questions to ask about how we use technology, what are the implications of technology in the classroom, but also sort of politically. And so I think that these questions of equity are things that unfortunately just tend to not be addressed. I think we're really happy to sort of have silver bullet-like conversations around education, and education plus technology just seems to sort of enhance that silver bullet to some sort of like platinum level device. And so I think, hopefully what we can sort of talk through today are the ways in which education technology sort of can ignore these things, how it can actually perhaps make inequalities worse. And that was more than a sentence introduction, so I'll shut up.
No, we never want you to shut up. I'm going to be the one shutting up here. I'm not sure where to start, but you mentioned something in your writing recently. I know your background is studying folklore, and this is the kind of thing that you do. There's we use this word myth so often to talk about something when we say it's almost like not true, like the myth of some technology to promise this, or the myth of equality. And you kind of brought out that in mythology, myths are heroic stories. And so, maybe it's because of Mythbusters, but is equity is it a myth, and what kind is it?
I think that this idea that I think in some ways the myth, one of the myths that we have around education, and as you said, by myth I mean really our most sacred story. I think that we use myth sometimes casually to mean, well, that's a lie. But I think that oftentimes the stories that are really become myths in our culture are the ones that we don't question at all. And I think that one of the myths that we have in our culture is this idea that education education alone is going to address systematic inequalities across the board. If people only had more education, then things are sort of going to be fixed. And I think we really believe in the power of education to be transformative. Now, that's not to say, I'm not saying that education isn't transformative, but I think that because we're so often so caught up in this idea that education alone is the answer, we tend to not recognize or talk about the ways in which education actually doesn't address these sort of systematic issues, and the ways in which education also might reinforce certain types of hierarchies, certain notions of privilege. And so I think that I think that we can think about equity as being a goal to attain and work towards. I think we should strive towards a more socially just world. But this idea that the way we get there is simply through education is only, to me, part of what we need to be addressing. And certainly adding technology to the mix doesn't somehow make our quest for justice more efficient. It doesn't somehow make it more relevant to 21st century demands for justice, or whatever the buzzwords might be.
So if it's like, in the same vein, like if we just have more open resources or more free videos or more iPads distributed, it's kind of ignoring this larger social context of what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's why one of the things that's really striking about the MOOC conversation in particular is that many of the MOOC entrepreneurs, I guess we call them, sort of have wrapped themselves in this notion that MOOCs are going to democratize education, that they are going to be this thing that's going to open up access and address sort of some of the systemic problems that we have around access to higher education. And I think that higher education is certainly a lot more complicated beast than just whether or not you have access to a textbook for your molecular biology class, right? It's not just a matter of do you have access to the content. Higher education has a whole lot of other working pieces that, again, if we're just sort of believing this really powerful story that somehow access to the content is the solution, then I think we're really missing addressing what some of the underlying issues might be.
Right, like Justin Reich's research, and where he finds that people disproportionately get advantage by, he studied wikis, but also the Khan videos, and it's much more complex than it looks like on the surface.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's, unfortunately, we tend to not really go for nuance, right? We really like things to be sort of black or white. We want it to be easy. We want things to fit into a neat little package that we can then put in a press release or fit into a commercial during the Super Bowl. We don't tend to want to have to say, well, it depends. Like, well, it depends doesn't really like get your politicians to sort of make policy decisions. Well, it depends doesn't get administrators to commit to doing things. But unfortunately, I think that well, it depends piece is we need to be doing a lot more of that.
So if you had the money and power of the LA Public School District and you were going to try to address this issue of equity in education, and you said, okay, let's scratch iPads off the list. I wouldn't want to answer that question, but I'm asking you, what would you do?
I mean, I think on one hand, I think that we have to like back things up even farther than that. I saw a statistic last week. I think that there's still 40 schools in the state of California that do not have access to the internet. Now, granted, California is a big state. 40 might not, but 40 40 schools, that's a lot of schools. I mean, we have some basic technological infrastructure issues that we need to address before we sort of move down the path of expecting every student to have some sort of iDevice so that they can consume their Pearson content, right? And so I think that there are other things that we need to think about, other infrastructure pieces, and not just access to Wi-Fi, right? But there are infrastructure pieces that we need to address long before we sort of go down this path of adopting what are really sort of a consumer device that is shiny and again has really nice commercials during the Super Bowl, but doesn't exactly address some of the needs of students, and it doesn't exactly address needs of the students in necessarily in affluent districts, but it certainly isn't necessarily something that's going to again fix education for poor students.
Are people still talking about digital divides?
I think they are. I mean, I think that they are. I think that on one hand, but the conversation has changed. There were, the Pew Internet Project always does really interesting research about what actually the shape of access looks like, and the vast majority of folks do have some internet connection, but for a chunk of people, that is through their mobile device, right? So their only access to the internet is through a smartphone. But that doesn't mean that they have that's really not an equitable access to the internet. I mean, if for no other reason than many of these folks reported that they quickly ran up against their data limits, right? Mm-hmm. So that they couldn't make it a whole month before reaching their data cap, that there were times in which they had to stop paying for access to the data plan on their phone because they couldn't afford it. So even though folks, on one hand, it's easy to say, well, almost everyone now has access to mobile communications, 24/7 access in their pocket. We can do all sorts of interesting mobile learning initiatives, but it's a lot more complicated than that. And as we move towards, particularly as we move towards even something like this, right? So a streaming video, access to either to consume video or to participate in a video streaming conversation, that's still out of the reach for a lot of folks whose access comes through a smartphone. Smartphones are great; they're incredibly powerful, but we haven't addressed the digital divide completely. And just saying everyone has access to a device, everyone has access to the internet, doesn't really reveal the difference between accessing the internet on a MacBook, on a DSL line that you can afford every month, and having to do so through an Android phone that runs out of data, by the 17th of every month.
Yeah, and the front edge is moving all the time, and
totally.
The lower edge is having trouble keeping up, and so
yeah,
it's a continual spread.
Yeah. And I think that that's only one of the, for me, that's only one of the questions too. One of the things that I notice, so it's a matter of access, right? So who has access to devices, who has access to the internet, who has access to high-speed internet as well, is in turn is also how is that technology being used? And this is one of the things to me that I feel like we need to do a better job addressing in education technology. I am a huge fan of the maker movement, for example. I think that the maker movement, to me, is sort of, it really is, in a lot of ways represents sort of project-based learning, inquiry-based learning. You're curious about how a machine works, and you can take it apart, hack on it, build it, tinker with it. That's, to me, a really powerful way of learning. But not everyone has access to those sorts of opportunities, right? So having a device, in the case of LAUSD, every student purportedly was supposed to get an iPad, but iPads are completely locked down, right? You can't open up you can. You can't really open up an iPad. You can't get to the command line of an iPad. You can't do programming on an iPad. And so the opportunities to tinker on an iPad are really different than, and if that's your, again, if the only access to a computing device you have is through your Android phone or through a school-issued iPad, that's a very different way of, that's a very different sort of access to technology. And then in the classroom, if the opportunities you have are, we're going to use your iPad so that we're really just doing worksheets, right? They're digital worksheets. Perhaps there are bells and whistles and sounds when you get the answer right, but it's still drill and kill. That's a very different use of technology than, again, being able to sort of build things with Raspberry Pi, being able to play with Makey, being able to explore things and do sort of creative work. Mm-hmm. And so are tools being used in the classroom really to do drill and kill, or are they being used to really enhance students' capabilities, to encourage creativity and curiosity? And again, I think if we look at what affluent kids get to do with technology, it looks really different than what poor kids get to do with technology.
In fact, we should have been celebrating that some of the kids hacked the iPads. There's some ingenuity going on there.
I think it was great. I mean, that was one of the things that sort of was, to me, like really disappointing about how that whole story played out, because one of the reasons that the students were frustrated was that when you give a student a device like an iPad or a smartphone, one of the things that students love about it is that it actually has a lot of the things that it gives them access to the things that they want to use technology for. They want to listen to music, right? They want to be able to watch YouTube videos. They want to be able to use it to chat with their friends, whether through text messaging or through various messaging apps. They want to be able to have something going on their iPad in the background while they would do something else. Mm-hmm. And the school district locked it down so that students couldn't play Pandora, they couldn't access YouTube, and so the students figured out a way around that. And I mean, of course they did. I mean, why give students an iPad if you really just want them to read a Pearson textbook and do worksheets? I mean, that seems like spending $800 a device on a shiny Pearson textbook is a really bad investment.
And that's a design decision that was made with how this was going to be rolled out, and it's almost a design strategy that goes beyond the design of the technology.
Totally. I mean, I think that's why this phrase "equity by design" is I think quite powerful, because we have to think about from the start how we're going to address not just the EdTech pieces, right, but the education, the broader education opportunities as well. And we can't just sort of plug those things in at the end. We can't just sort of say at the end of designing an experience or a course or a program or a policy that at the end we're going to sort of check a couple of boxes to see that we've done X, Y, or Z. We really need to sort of think from the beginning, what do these opportunities look like that are equitable, but they also open up opportunities for everybody, and again, not just opportunities for affluent students to be able to tinker and explore and do projects. It's not just the smart kids that should get to do meaningful work, right? I mean, this should be something that is open and available and encouraged for everybody.
Yeah, and you've kind of hinted at or written about how inequities kind of factor into the design of technology, and I've always wanted to probe that a little bit more, because I'm someone who codes, and I never thought about am I bringing some bias that I'm not aware of, and even I think you've talked about it. The designers of the internet were white, North American, European. And there's some Russian and et cetera of the original computers, but how do we start thinking about that more in this idea about technology and its own design?
So I've been thinking about this a lot lately in terms of Yik Yak, which is an anonymous messaging app that's really designed around and pitched towards college communities. So it's sort of geo-fenced so that the messages show up based on where you are, and it's become quite a horrible sort of reflection of almost every campus I've visited recently. I've talked to the students, and many of them are quite embarrassed about what Yik Yak reveals. And so the way in which Yik Yak works is purportedly you're anonymous. Your name is not attached, or even an avatar attached to your updates. But then, much like some of these other programs or sites on the web, updates are voted up or down. And this mechanism of the voting up or down thing to me is really fascinating, because this seems to be a mechanism that is in place with some of the most popular sites on the internet. Reddit, right? The front page of the internet, Hacker News, Stack Overflow. People see this as a way of surfacing, people say that this is a way of surfacing the most interesting and the most important content. But or the best, right? This is the best answer on Stack Overflow, the best post on Hacker News supposedly are the ones that rise to the top. But that's not what happens at all. In fact, often some of the most horrific things end up on the front page of Hacker News, or the front page of Hacker News or Reddit. The most horrible responses are voted up to the top. It surfaces and reinforces the sort of hegemonic culture that, again, is a very young white male culture. And I think that we're seeing that in Yik Yak, for example, and that's by design, right? The design of Yik Yak isn't, I mean, I'm not saying that that university campuses are all wonderful places where there is no sexism and no racism. Not at all. But they really do surface that sort of behavior. And I don't think it's necessarily because the posts are anonymous. That's what some people say, is when people are not, when people are anonymous, they say things more freely. I think that it's actually this mechanism of the voting up or down of certain kinds of posts. And I think that that's a design decision. That's a programming decision.
It was the easiest one.
Yeah.
You can calculate it just like that. I could do that.
Right. And so, when I see that sort of discussion forums, right, message forums, move into the learning management system or move into MOOCs, I'm like, I don't know, what does it mean, for example, and MOOCs tend to already have a significantly higher number of men participating in them. What is it going to mean when we are adopting these sorts of technological decisions that surface the most upvoted posts to the top? Again, I don't think it means that the best things, the most shining positive examples, the best sort of most interesting insights in the classroom are going to be what's surfaced. And that's a technological decision.
So what are some other ways we could provide these slices into these massively voluminous spaces where people are communicating, other than this sort of, it's almost like it's like a rush at a record store when it opens. It's like a stampede in some sense. And
yeah, it's really interesting to watch too, and the kinds of I'm not sure what the answer would be. I mean, in some ways, is it going to be limiting or weighting people's voices differently? I know that edX was exploring trying to surface the difference between someone who was asking a question, and question posts on a forum sort of appeared and were weighted differently than explanation responses. And so I think that some of it has to do with just rethinking the ways in which things get surfaced, so that it's not simply this got 16 upvotes, therefore it must be great. Like if it got 16 upvotes by a certain group, a certain group within the class or within the community, maybe that's a different sort of metric, then that's the best. Maybe it's a reflection of that group's power. And I don't think we really spend some time thinking about what does that group, what does the power of that group sort of reflect.
I got a question. I want to get to that. They come through the Q&A, but since you mentioned Reddit, and Mike Caulfield, our wise friend out there, tweeted this morning that Reddit is instituting some changes. And I know I'm not major into Reddit, but for a lot of people it can be more vile than YouTube comments, and so it sounds like they're trying to institute a little more moderating. Does it feel real to you?
I think it's going to be really very, very interesting to watch, and I think that it's important because I think that Reddit. I mean, it's to me. I don't go to Reddit, and that's I feel sad about that. I mean, and I feel excluded. If Reddit is the front page of the internet, and I know as a woman online I'm not welcome there. I mean, that really sucks. I do think that Reddit's CEO currently is Ellen Pao, who was recently involved in a lawsuit against the venture capitalist firm Kleiner Smith Perkins Caulfield, and so I think that I'm really pleased to have seen her take the lead on trying to change the culture of Reddit and more broadly change the culture of Silicon Valley and the tech industry. Because in some ways we're not going to address these questions if we keep driving women, if we keep driving people of color, if we keep driving people who aren't from the sort of global north out of the conversation. It really quickly becomes an echo chamber when you've acted so badly that no one else wants to come to your party but your bro friends.
Yeah. So I think this question we have is talking something about economics and inferring about flat currency. I'm thinking maybe a Bitcoin allegory, but asking to address what kind of roles economic structures and incentives might have on tech and higher ed. I'm assuming is maybe understanding the impact of economic inequalities.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what we're seeing, it's really interesting because I think in some ways Silicon Valley has us hoodwinked, or the tech industry has us hoodwinked into or the venture capital community is exerting its power a lot more than it actually reflects in the economy, right? So venture capital is only a tiny, tiny piece of the economy, but you would think the ways in which Mark Andreessen and Peter Thiel get to sort of command attention within the tech world, that 80% of the U.S.'s economic dollars were sort of were venture capital. It's a smaller amount of our economy than the prison system, right? Yeah, and the prison system is a pretty good chunk. Yeah. So I think they're really driving a conversation and trying to become politically more powerful. I think that we are seeing the tech industry becoming really powerful politically, both in terms of the lobbying dollars, right? Google is one of the spends a lot of money on lobbying. The telecommunications industry, right? The Verizons and Time Warner Cables and Comcasts spend a ton of money on lobbying. And then I think more at the state, local, and even school level, really these seem like powerful stories, I think, that are being pitched to administrators, pitched to all of us, really about that our future necessarily has to look like something that's adopted, not just their product, but their sort of ideology that comes with it as well. So I think that in some ways, I think that their voice is a lot louder than their actual economic power. But I think that they're trying very, very, very hard to reshape conversations that give them more economic power.
Okay, and to the questioner, if I horribly mangled that question and didn't get your, please ask again. I'd also wonder, it's interesting. It seems like venture capital is like this major driver. So, are there other drivers that might influence development of new technology? Social awareness. The good of the world.
That's the danger, I think, of part of this ideology is this notion that we've. Like a lot of folks shrug their shoulders now and say, well, we're seeing the public funding of education on the decline, but it's not ever coming back. We don't, we're going to have to sort of find other ways to fund schools. We're going to have to find other ways to fund education than through public funding. And I don't think that I don't think that we need to necessarily see that as being a truth. I think that in fact we should and could push back on that narrative that somehow public money is gone and never ever will it return again. And so I think that handing over this story, right, handing over this myth to the private sector, to the markets, is something that we should be pretty wary of. And handing over that story about the future of education to markets and then to technology, even more so. I think that we can ask better questions about why would we want to defund public higher education? Why would we want to outsource what we've done, what education has done to folks from the tech industry? And maybe there are some reasons why we'd want to do some of that, but maybe there are some reasons why we sure the hell wouldn't.
It's almost, it's like we missed, I'm not assuming everybody has some of these epic stories, but, the teachers that affected us, not everybody has had the best teachers, but there's probably been one who showed that they cared about us. You forget about all these things that you can't do with technology that a teacher does.
Well, and I think too we seem to have like you said, I'd spend a lot of time talking about these myths, and I'm really interested in the way in which we tend to rewrite the history of technology. And you would think the way in which Silicon Valley talks about itself, talks about its origins, is that government and universities had nothing to do with it. That this was somehow that Hewlett and Packard were in their garage in Palo Alto, and they just sort of came up with this idea that had no connection to the fact that they were both at Stanford, right? That they actually had access to people who had huge research labs. That they didn't sort of just come up with their ideas in this sort of isolated. It wasn't simply the garage, but we tell this story about the garage that erases the connections to government grants, that erases the connections to university education, to laboratories, to hundreds of people working on projects. Instead, it becomes the story of one or two heroes, right? It's the story of Steve Jobs. It's the story of Bill Gates. And we're very good about erasing the fact that lots of these innovations happened thanks to universities.
Yeah, and that's I so enjoyed your series this year of really digging into the history of everything from teaching machines to the most recent one about I never knew that there were airplanes flying around trying to distribute video courses.
Yeah, actually that's a post that I'm working on, another connection to this, that I think that we should think a lot about the way in which television, education television operated, because we had this other model for networks. We talk a lot about networks as being something that the internet gave us, but the networks are something that we saw with television as well. And so how do we recognize what's really different about the internet from television in terms of broadcasting, in terms of the read-writability of the web, for example, but also the way in which power and control work, right? So one of the strengths of the internet, I think, is that it is sort of this decentralized thing, whereas television networks are very much about centralized control, deciding what content appears, who gets to sort of decide the schedule, who gets to have a voice. And I fear that we're seeing the internet start to look more and more like television, where certain channels are really dictating the shape of things. And to me, that that's always a warning sign for for questions of power and equity, when you see these monsters like Google, when you see these monsters like Facebook.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's so easy to assume that the internet will be like the way it has been, and there's things attacking its very foundation, and
Yeah.
it's pretty bad. Another question from the Q&A. Someone's designing an educator looking for some suggestions for a human-centered design project, interested in pedagogy involved. They're looking for how you sort of teach and include these ideas of equity, design, and equality. IDEO, I think, is a design engineering approach, I think. But for people looking to be inclusive in these design decisions of their courses, I would just say read everything that you've written, but that's too easy.
I think one of the things that we forget is, and I think that this isn't just a technology issue. This is an institutional question around education as well. Is that I think that we don't necessarily do a good job recognizing that students have agency, and that students should be subjects in their learning and not objects of the system, right? Not objects of the institution that's going to shape and decide what they should learn, and not objects of technology that are going to shape and decide what they should learn. So for me, I think that we have to sort of think about how do we sort of shift and give students more voice. And by that I don't mean how do we reshape education as a sort of consumerist vision, right? I don't mean how do we turn students from students into consumers. That's the danger, I think, of not being critical about what we mean by this. But really, how do we design for the things that students, so that students actually are active and participate in these discussions, that they aren't sort of this absent other that's talked about, but that's never included in these design decisions. I mean, how often do we see students participating in conferences? How often do we bring students to the table when we're talking about what technology to buy, or what textbooks to use, or what the shape of their coursework needs to look like? So I think that bringing students to the table is one of the first and most important things we should be thinking about. It doesn't necessarily sort of erase the hierarchies, but I think also it sort of counters this notion that we have, this imaginary student that we often have in our heads, who's Tressie McMillan Cotton talks about the roaming autodidact, that all students that are designed for are self-motivated learners that understand how to negotiate and navigate institutions, that they know how to get resources, that they have a network that they're connected to, that they can sort of navigate the learning experiences because.
Yeah.
And I think we need to sort of really rethink about who students are, what students look like, what students need, and listen to them, and not just make the assumption that everyone in college is sort of like this upper middle class 18-year-old. That's just not what learners look like.
And that's such a long way to go, because students aren't used to being asked, and
Right.
and they're probably put off when you ask. It's like, wait a minute, you're supposed to tell us, but I've seen examples of that, and it doesn't take much to completely flip that.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately that's I think one of the problems with waiting until it's somehow not until college that you're sort of given these opportunities to sort of have more of a say in what you do, have more of a say in your learning, and by then we've sort of beaten it out of students, right? They come to kindergarten really super curious about the world around them, asking great questions, and by the time they graduate high school, they've got their baseball cap down and they hope that no one notices them. And they don't want to ask questions. They just want to do whatever the teacher says in order to get the assignment and be done.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really hard to sort of have someone have spent 13 years learning to be an object of the institution, and then suddenly say to them, congratulations, now, along with student debt, you do get a little more voice in what happens.
But perhaps, I mean, in other venues now, perhaps thanks to some technologies, I mean, they're having experiences that are radically different to their school experiences, and
Yeah.
that creates conflict.
I think that's really, really interesting to think about the ways in which I think the way in which it's more apparent now that the kinds of opportunities that students have to be learners, and I think that we always were, but I think that they tended to be more isolated, right? So you might have learned. I had an uncle who was a fly fisherman, and he taught me how to tie a fly. But that wasn't something that was just a sort of a private opportunity in his garage. That wasn't something that other students got to participate in. That wasn't something that others got to see. And the garage was the garage, the basement, the kitchen. These are all very these were places in which I think students have always done. Children have always learned and had learning opportunities at home, but they were very isolated. And so I think it's different today because I think that we see it more, right? It's not simply, you can still be working in your garage, but I think that then you run back in, check out YouTube, or you broadcast from your garage.
Yeah, I went out with someone who's like a bird watcher, and I hear a bird, I was like, that's a bird or something like that. But watching how the master bird watcher was teaching was really interesting, because you can't do it in a video. I mean, you can do some, but it's basically maybe an apprentice model sort of thing, but that experiential part is not something you're going to get from a lecture video.
Yeah, it's funny because to me that I'm so sort of suspicious of these arguments that we make in some ways about the sort of YouTube, learning from YouTube, because back 20 plus years ago when I did my undergraduate degree, I did it through distance education, and at the time I was shipped a box of video cassettes. And so there were things that I could watch. I took statistics through video cassette correspondence course. And there I could replay, rewind, 100 times, and I still didn't understand, statistical regression. I mean, I think that having the opportunity to refresh and rewind is great, but it's without that sort of without that human help, without mentorship, without the person, I think that I don't think that the ability to hit replay is necessarily the only missing piece.
Has anything changed for you in the last year with sort of your interactions with the EdTech industry? Are they any better, or are they still the same?
I think that the industry is still the same. I keep predicting that we're going to have to that the bubble is going to burst, that investors are going to look, as they did the last time the bubble burst, look at EdTech and say, you know what, there isn't actually the next Google here. We're going to stop this sort of madness of investment. I think that there's just so much, despite what I said earlier, there's a lot of money sort of flowing into startups right now. There's still a lot of money flowing into the early stage of startups. And so I don't think that there's really a lot of reason for people to be reflective. I still think that the Silicon Valley startup myth is going strong in education. Folks aren't really asking questions yet about is this working. I think the LA iPad issue gave districts a lot of pause, but I'm not sure I've seen that sort of trickle down to seeing a lot of entrepreneurs be necessarily reflective about what they're doing.
Right. I lost my train of questions here, so I'm just going to have to make something up. I was going to say something in the beginning about, we're not, I'm a white male technologist, and it's not meant to be like the diversity panel, but it's a tricky thing. And so, I know, that for some people like Tressie, like to always be asked to speak, to represent, Black Americans. That's probably a burden to have to speak on the issues of women all the time. I mean, there might be sometimes you don't feel like doing that, and it's got to take a toll. So
yeah.
I don't know if that's a question or anything. It's just more of a statement. And if anything, the more this has, to me, it's surfaced a lot more. I don't know for other people, but just trying to be more aware of our representations.
I think that this is really important. I mean, and I was just at a couple of technology events that weren't education technology events, and it's always really startling as a woman to walk into these events and see that there are, in a room full of 300 people, that you can count on one hand the number of women. And when you look at the people who are speaking on stage, that there are very, 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 very few women and very, very, very few people of color who are given a platform to talk. And so I think that we have a long way to go to address that. I mean, I'm hopeful that education can do so. I'm hopeful that it can do so long before the rest of the tech world does. But I'm not sure. I mean, I look at the kinds of the folks that get chosen as speakers at education technology events, and I don't necessarily see, I don't necessarily see us sort of winning the sort of any diversity awards there as well. The voices that get picked up and recognized as being, the education technology leaders, they still overwhelmingly, I think, tend to be white men from Europe or North America.
Right, and but DML managed to do it. I looked at the website. There's not one white male, and I'm like, that's pretty good. Is it that impossible?
I think that's the thing. I think that you have to. I mean, it again comes back to equity by design. This can't be something that you can't put up the list of the speakers at your conference, and then say, oh yeah, well we know they're all white guys, but we promise we've got more speakers coming. You have to say from the outset that this is a priority. Yeah. And I think you have to sort of also then ask questions that are going to be interesting beyond, you have to sort of change the frame of the conference. You have to change the frame of the questions. You have to make the questions seem relevant and meaningful. And I think that if your conference or doesn't have to be a conference, but if the questions that you're asking are really only meaningful to a small group of engineers, then the small group, you've made no efforts to sort of change the demographics of that small group of engineers, then it very quickly becomes an echo chamber.
Yeah, and it's not just looking at a bunch of pictures and making some judgment. It is a message, and I was thinking about, I just loved the images from your slides with the Wonder Woman talk, and this whole thing of like, yeah, there's a female superhero, but she's kind of legit. Was just brilliant, and some stuff that people have been tweeting about the new Avengers movie.
Right.
Which is fascinating, and on one hand, you could say people could say it's only a movie, but they pointed out that in the comics have gotten very diverse. The movie has not.
Right. I mean, we have a female Thor, right?
Yeah.
I think that one of the things, too, that one of the reasons that I chose to talk about Wonder Woman, besides the absolutely fascinating history and connection with educational psychology, is that I think that we still have this mythology around people are going to save us, people are going to rescue us, technology is going to rescue us, right? There was the movie Waiting for Superman. This notion that there has to be this sort of hero, and this hero is going to look and act a certain way. And to come back to this question of students, students are somehow never depicted in this as being, they're the ones that need to be saved. The system needs to be saved. We have this whole idea about rescuing that again, puts people in the position of being a damsel in distress, of being a broken system that needs to be saved. And I think that though that's a story that doesn't necessarily recognize that all of us should have a voice, and that we need to do a much, much better job of thinking about which voices are marginalized and which ones are heralded as being avengers, right?
Mm-hmm. It's a rather long road.
Yeah.
Do you ever get tired?
I get tired all the time.
Yeah, it's understandable. What are you kind of looking forward to in terms of what's going to happen at DML, since that's sort of the theme of this webinar series?
I'm really looking for. I mean, I'm really looking forward to the panels that are going to be both the ones that sort of practically address, right? So people that are actually practically thinking about these things in the classroom, these projects as they design them, both in sort of formal and in informal sessions. I'm also interested in, I'm looking forward to some of the panels that are still perhaps not theoretical, but imaginative. So Tim Mon and Saba Saheli Singh are doing a panel on design fiction. And I think that design fiction is a really interesting way of thinking about it's sort of science fiction meets design, and what happens if we sort of imagine the future forward, right? If we sort of, and of course it's future facing, so we can recognize it's fiction. Hmm. But if we sort of hit the fast forward button on the state of the world today, what are things going to look like? Right, and I think that sometimes we end up with design fiction that's pretty horrific, and I think that should give us pause and sort of then be able to step back and say, all right, if we're going to build towards a more just and equitable future, what pieces are we missing? Right, what pieces of the plot, what pieces of the setting, what characters are we missing? And so I'm looking forward to thinking about, as we imagine the future, sort of what are the pieces that are, in what ways are we moving towards a sort of a really frightening dystopian future, and then how do we stop and not sort of hand ourselves over to doom, but say, well, this is our opportunity to intervene, right? We want to build a better world. We don't want to sort of give over the storytelling capability to the Peter Thiels and Mark Andreessens of the world, besides the fact that they tell horrible, frightening stories. We can have a say, and we can build a different future.
It's almost like if I get this theme of instead of waiting for Superman, I mean we can demand this stuff. I think it seems kind of basic, but how much we've forgotten that we don't have to take all these visions necessarily.
Right.
And it's a lot to change, but it can be done.
And that we can act as a collective. I mean, I think that this is one of the pieces that I think that I worry about with a move towards the personal computer and algorithms that are sort of crafted to you. I worry that we're sort of thinking about this future in which everything is sort of perfect, like designed for the individual, and how do we make sure that we're not losing control of the ability to sort of come together as a collective, that we're not losing community, that we can have collective action. And I do think that we see some of that online. I think that we see that in the sort of social media activism around Ferguson, for example, that there is a strong drive towards community, and that we can use technology to build community, but I think that we have to sort of remember that there's a social collective piece to us, and that we're not these individual automatons, all with our sort of perfectly designed Google algorithm to give us to give us movie recommendations or dining recommendations or course recommendations.
Which we could get on our iPad, because we could just consume it.
We could.
Do you have an iPad?
I do have an iPad.
Yeah. They're not bad. They do some things. Somebody from the chat, you have a fan out there, so they want a link to your Regner research, which should be hackeducation.com, correct?
That's right. Yep, hackeducation.com.
Yeah. Self-published, right? No?
Self-published, yes.
Yeah, you do technology. We know that.
I do. If you look at my GitHub, profile, you will see that I have I can make a commit to GitHub every day.
And I'm finally catching up because I'm doing some playing around with Jekyll and GitHub, and it's a good thing to be learning how to do all that.
Yeah.
So anything else? We're almost at the end of the hour.
No, I think that, one thing I think is important to think about when we think about, the technology piece is that these things don't all play out equally for all of us, right? So I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which, talk about algorithms and surveillance and school and discipline, and these notions that we're going to sort of hand over some of our important education-oriented decisions to algorithms, I think should give us pause. These things are not neutral. Technology is not neutral. Algorithms are not neutral. And I think that we have to sort of back it up again and think about equity. We have to think about the implications of the tech we use, because it doesn't play out on our bodies. It doesn't play out in our lives equally. So none of this is neutral. The stakes are actually incredibly high. And so I think we need to be a lot more critical about where technology is headed.
All right. And I totally forgot to ask, because you always wear cool T-shirts. What's in your shirt?
Oh, today's a Gamergate, a nod to Gamergate, saying, "You have died of ethics in games journalism."
That's brilliant. Maybe, is that an original, or do you find that somewhere?
No, it was a fundraiser to get more women becoming video game developers. So.
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining. For me, it's like, I get an hour to talk to Audrey.
Thank you.
This is great. So this is the stuff. There'll be a full recording of this webinar, so you can enjoy it on your iPad or any other device. You can get it at www.connectedlearning.tv, and there's a lot of other great series on there, well worth watching. So this has been the second of these. I think they all revolve around Leaders of the Tracks at DML 2015 conference. Keep talking about it on Twitter. I'm terrible at this. Hashtag DML 2015 and Connected Learning. Definitely want to follow Audrey Waters on Twitter. So Audrey, it's like Water. I keep saying Waters. It's like Waters, but Audrey Waters. And you can easily find her everywhere if you search for her. Please share, what you got from this, or throw some barbs at us. And then come back to Connected Learning TV. Sign up for the newsletter. And thank you. And go to LA in June. I'm going there.
Come to LA. Yeah, I hope to see you.
You're home, man.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. So thanks again. And someone will probably turn off the signal. We got 2 minutes. We can still goof around.